Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Imagine an empire so vast it stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia. An empire whose laws, language, and engineering feats still echo in our world today. For over 1,000 years, one city ruled them all: Rome. But how did a small city-state on the Italian peninsula rise to conquer the known world? And what forces, both internal and external, led to its spectacular collapse? Join us on an epic journey through time as we uncover the incredible story of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Every great story of empire begins with a myth, a narrative woven to explain the improbable, to justify the extraordinary. Before the legions, before the Senate, before the marble columns and sprawling aqueducts, there was a story of two boys and a wolf. This is the foundation myth of Rome, a tale steeped in divinity and blood. It begins not with mortals, but with a god, Mars, the god of war, who fathers twin sons with a mortal priestess, Rhea Silvia. Her uncle, the usurper King Amulius, fearing a prophecy that the twins would overthrow him, orders them to be cast into the Tiber River. But fate, or perhaps the river god himself, intervenes. The basket carrying the infants Romulus and Remus washes ashore at the foot of the Palatine Hill. Here, the story takes its most iconic turn. They are discovered not by a human, but by a she-wolf, the Lupa, who, instead of harming them, suckles them as her own. They are later found by a shepherd, Faustulus, who raises them as his sons. The boys grow into natural leaders, strong and charismatic. Upon learning their true heritage, they return to their ancestral home, kill the tyrant Amulius, and restore their grandfather to the throne. Their destiny, however, is not to rule an old city, but to build a new one. They return to the hill where the she-wolf found them. But a dispute arises. Which brother would be the founder and king? They agree to settle the matter through augury, a ritual of observing birds. Remus, on the Aventine Hill, sees 6 vultures. But Romulus, on the Palatine, sees 12. Declared the victor by the gods, Romulus begins to plow the sacred boundary, the Pomerium, for his new city. In a fit of jealousy and mockery, Remus leaps over the freshly dug furrow, a sacrilegious act. Enraged, Romulus strikes his brother down, declaring, "So shall it be for all who dare to cross my walls." And so, the city of Rome, destined to rule the world, was founded on the murder of a brother, a grim prophecy that violence and ambition would forever be etched into its soul. For 2.5 centuries, Rome was ruled by kings. Some were wise, others were cruel, but all held absolute power. The 7th and final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, embodied the tyranny that Romans would grow to despise. His reign was marked by arrogance, bloodshed, and a profound disregard for Roman traditions and the Senate. The breaking point, as immortalized by the historian Livy, was a deeply personal and tragic event: the assault on the virtuous noblewoman Lucretia by the king's son. Her subsequent public suicide, after extracting an oath of vengeance from her father and husband, ignited the flames of revolution. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, a man who had feigned idiocy to survive Tarquin's purges, the leading families of Rome rose up. They swore a sacred oath never again to be ruled by a king. Tarquin and his family were expelled from the city in 509 BCE, and the very concept of monarchy became anathema. In its place, the Romans established a radical new form of government, the res publica, literally the public thing or the public affair. Power would no longer be vested in a single hereditary ruler. Instead, it was to be shared. The ultimate authority, the imperium, was granted to two consuls, elected annually, who acted as joint heads of state and commanders of the army. This division was a deliberate check on power. Each consul could veto the other's actions, ensuring no one man could dominate the state. The Senate, an advisory council of elder statesmen from the patrician class, gained immense influence, guiding policy and administration. This new republic was not born out of a philosophical ideal, but from a visceral reaction to tyranny. The word rex, meaning king, became the most reviled term in the Roman political vocabulary for centuries. This foundational act of rejecting monarchy defined Roman identity, creating a system built on shared governance, civic duty, and a deep-seated fear of absolute power. A fear that would ironically pave the way for the rise of emperors centuries later. The overthrow of the monarchy did not create a society of equals. The early Roman Republic was a state divided, a simmering cauldron of social tension. On one side were the patricians, the aristocratic elite, who traced their lineage to the first senators appointed by Romulus. They controlled all the land, held all political offices, and interpreted the sacred laws. On the other side were the plebeians, the common people. They were the farmers, the artisans, the soldiers who fought and died for Rome. Yet they were barred from power and often crippled by debt. Unwritten laws were manipulated by patrician magistrates, and debt could lead to bondage or slavery. This fundamental inequality could not last. The plebeians had a powerful weapon, their own necessity. Rome was a city-state in constant conflict with its neighbors, and its survival depended on the plebeian legions. In 494 BCE, they deployed this weapon in a stunning act of civil disobedience. Feeling exploited and unheard, the entire plebeian populace, including the soldiers, seceded from Rome. They marched out of the city and camped on the Mons Sacer, the sacred mount, threatening to found a new city of their own. The patricians faced a crisis. Without its army and its workforce, Rome was defenseless. They were forced to negotiate. This first secession resulted in a revolutionary compromise. The plebeians were allowed to elect their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs. These tribunes had an extraordinary power, the veto, the ability to block any action by a patrician magistrate that they deemed harmful to the common people. Their bodies were declared sacrosanct, meaning anyone who harmed them could be killed without trial. This was just the beginning of a conflict that would last for 2 centuries. The struggle of the orders saw further plebeian gains, most notably the publication of the 12 Tables, Rome's first written legal code, which made the law accessible to all and harder to abuse. This long, arduous internal conflict fundamentally reshaped the Republic, forging a more integrated and resilient state, yet it revealed a permanent fault line in Roman society. As Rome solidified its control over the Italian peninsula, it came face to face with another Mediterranean superpower, Carthage. Located in modern-day Tunisia, Carthage was a formidable maritime empire, a trading behemoth with a powerful navy that dominated the seas. A clash between the rising land power of Rome and the established sea power of Carthage was inevitable. The conflict, spanning over a century, would be fought in 3 brutal wars known as the Punic Wars. The first was a grinding 23-year struggle primarily for control of the island of Sicily. Rome, a nation of farmers and soldiers, had to build a navy from scratch, learning the hard way through disastrous defeats before finally achieving victory. But this was merely the prelude. The Second Punic War was the true existential struggle, a conflict defined by one of history's greatest military commanders, Hannibal Barca. Sworn to a sacred oath of eternal hatred for Rome, Hannibal executed one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. He marched an army, complete with war elephants, from Spain, over the treacherous Pyrenees and the snow-capped Alps, and into Italy itself. For 15 years, he ravaged the Italian countryside, inflicting a series of catastrophic defeats on the Romans. The Battle of Cannae, in 216 BCE, stands as Rome's darkest hour, a tactical masterpiece where Hannibal's smaller army encircled and annihilated a Roman force of nearly 80,000 men. Any other state would have collapsed, but Rome's spirit did not break. They refused to surrender. They adopted the delaying tactics of Fabius Maximus, the cunctator, avoiding direct engagement while rebuilding their strength. A brilliant new general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, took the fight to Carthaginian territory in Spain and then, daringly, to Africa itself. This forced Hannibal to return home to defend Carthage. On the plains of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio finally defeated Hannibal, earning the title Africanus. The victory was total. Carthage was stripped of its empire, its navy, and its wealth. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean, a superpower forged in the crucible of near annihilation. The path to empire, for Rome, as for the Habsburgs, was paved with the stones of conquered cities and the bones of defeated enemies. After humbling the formidable Hannibal and surviving its darkest hour, Rome's gaze turned outward with an insatiable hunger. The Second Punic War had forged the Republic into an unparalleled military machine, and now that machine required fuel. The final act against its old rival Carthage was not a war, but an extermination. In 146 BC, the city was razed, its fields sown with salt, a brutal and symbolic act that declared Roman dominance absolute. This was a lesson in power that future empires, including the one Zeta would inherit, understood implicitly. Rivals must not simply be defeated. They must be erased. With Carthage gone, the Mediterranean truly became Mare Nostrum, our sea. Macedon and the Greek city-states, the heirs to Alexander the Great's legacy, were next. They fell, not just to the disciplined might of the legions, but to Rome's shrewd diplomacy, which turned allies against each other until all were subjugated. Vast territories in Spain, North Africa, and the East were annexed, flooding Rome with unimaginable wealth. Slaves, gold, and grain poured into the capital, transforming its society in ways that would prove catastrophic. This influx of riches created a new, powerful elite while dispossessing the small-scale farmers who had been the Republic's backbone. These men, returning from long campaigns, found their lands bought up by wealthy aristocrats to create massive slave-run estates. The very conquests that made Rome a superpower were simultaneously eroding the foundations of its republican society. It was a paradox of expansion. The external victories created the internal weaknesses that would later tear the state apart. A historical echo of an empire growing too vast and diverse to maintain its core identity. A fate that would one day befall Zeta's own Austro-Hungarian realm. In the heart of this gilded, conquering republic, a deep sickness was taking root. The immense wealth from its new provinces flowed only to the top, creating a chasm between the senatorial elite and the landless, impoverished Roman citizens. It is a timeless story of inequality, one that would resonate centuries later in the courts of Vienna as revolutionary fervor swept across Europe. Into this volatile landscape stepped two brothers of noble birth, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They saw the injustice, the existential threat posed by a disenfranchised populace. Tiberius, elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BC, proposed a simple yet revolutionary solution: a land reform law to redistribute public land held by the wealthy back to the poor. He bypassed the hostile Senate, taking his case directly to the People's Assembly. This was a direct challenge to the established order, a violation of political tradition. The aristocracy, the optimates, saw him not as a reformer, but as a demagogue, a would-be king. When Tiberius sought an unprecedented second term as tribune to see his reforms through, the Senate's patience snapped. A mob of senators and their clients, using improvised clubs, beat Tiberius and 300 of his followers to death in the open forum. Political assassination had now become a tool of statecraft. A decade later, his younger brother Gaius took up the cause with an even broader and more ambitious platform of reforms. He sought to stabilize grain prices, extend citizenship rights, and further challenge senatorial power. For his efforts, he met the same fate. The Senate, for the first time, issued a final decree, effectively a death warrant. Gaius was killed, along with thousands of his supporters. The failure of the Gracchi was a tragic turning point. It demonstrated that the Republic's institutions were no longer capable of resolving internal conflicts peacefully. The seeds of revolution had been sown, and they had been watered with blood. The path of reform was closed. The path of violence was now open. Into the chaos forged by Marius and Sulla stepped a man whose name would become synonymous with absolute power: Gaius Julius Caesar. A brilliant politician, a charismatic orator, and a military genius, Caesar was the culmination of all the trends that had been eroding the Republic. He understood the new rules of the game perfectly. He was an aristocrat who championed the people, a populares who used public appeal and lavish spending to build a fanatical following in Rome. He formed a powerful, albeit unstable, alliance with the wealthy Marcus Licinius Crassus and the renowned General Pompey the Great. This first triumvirate was a private pact among three men to subvert the state and carve up power for themselves, making a mockery of the Republic's institutions. Caesar's masterstroke was securing the governorship of Gaul. For nearly a decade, he waged a brutal and brilliant campaign of conquest, extending Roman territory to the English Channel. More importantly, he forged a veteran army of unparalleled skill and devotion. His legions were loyal not to Rome, but to him personally. He was their patron, their source of income, and their guarantee of a future. The Senate, led by his former ally Pompey, watched his growing power with increasing terror. They saw him not as a Roman general, but as a potential king. They ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to face prosecution. Caesar was at a precipice, a moment of decision at a small river marking the boundary of Italy, the Rubicon. In 49 BC, he led his 13th legion across it, uttering the famous words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. It was an irrevocable act of treason and a declaration of war against the state. The civil war that ensued was a global conflict, fought across the entire Mediterranean. Caesar's ultimate victory at Pharsalus and his subsequent consolidation of power marked the end. Though he would be assassinated by senators desperate to restore the old ways, it was too late. He had laid the final foundations for empire, proving that one man, with an army at his back and the will to act, could bring a 500-year-old republic to its knees. The year 1918 marked the death rattle of an ancient world. For Empress Zeta and Emperor Karl, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was not a dictatorship, but a divinely ordained multi-ethnic realm. Yet, to the forces of nationalism tearing it apart, the 1,000-year-old Habsburg Monarchy was a tyrant that had to be slain. The final blows came swiftly in the autumn. Following the military collapse on the Italian front, the empire disintegrated within weeks. Karl's last-ditch effort to salvage his realm, the Völkerbund Manifesto proposing a federal union, was ignored. One by one, the peoples of the empire declared their independence. The dictator, the imperial system itself, was being dismantled. On November 11th, the same day the armistice was signed in the West, Karl was pressured by his ministers to sign a proclamation. In it, he acknowledged the Austrian people's right to self-determination and relinquished his role in the affairs of state. For Zeta, this was an unforgivable concession. She saw it as a betrayal of their sacred duty. As Karl hesitated, she famously told him, "A sovereign can never abdicate. He can be deposed. That is force. But abdicate, never, never, never." Though Karl never used the word abdication, the act was seen as such by the world. The imperial family left the grandeur of Schönbrunn Palace for the relative isolation of a hunting lodge at Eckartsau. The next day, the Republic of German Austria was proclaimed. The Ides of March had come late in November, but the result was the same: a political assassination. The monarchy was dead, its power extinguished in a flurry of proclamations and popular uprisings. For Zeta, however, this was not an end. It was merely a battle lost in a war for their throne that she intended to wage for the rest of her life. With the old republic, the Habsburg Empire, shattered, new powers rose from its ashes. In Hungary, a man who had once sworn a soldier's oath to Emperor Karl now held the reins of power. Admiral Miklos Horthy, the newly appointed regent. He was the Octavian in this new political order, a former subordinate consolidating control in the vacuum left by Caesar's fall. From their exile in Switzerland, Zeta and Karl watched, believing Horthy would honor his oath and facilitate their return. They were mistaken. In the spring of 1921, they launched their first attempt at restoration. Karl traveled incognito to Budapest, confronting Horthy on Easter Sunday. He demanded the regent step aside. Horthy, citing threats of invasion from neighboring countries and internal instability, refused. Humiliated, Karl was forced to retreat. Zeta was undeterred. The failure only hardened her resolve. 6 months later, in October, they tried again, this time with more force. The imperial couple flew to Hungary on a rickety airplane, landing in a field where loyalist troops awaited them. Zeta, the empress, marched alongside her husband and his soldiers on their journey toward Budapest. It was a dramatic, final gamble to reclaim their kingdom. But their Octavian was prepared. Horthy, declaring them rebels, dispatched his own military forces. The two Hungarian armies, one loyal to its absent king and the other to its present regent, clashed on the outskirts of the capital. The royalists were swiftly defeated. Karl and Zeta were captured and held prisoner in a monastery. The great powers of Europe, who had no desire to see a Habsburg return to power, sealed their fate. Stripped of their titles and possessions, they were handed over to the British, who would carry them into their final, inescapable exile. The ascent of the new men was complete. The last vestiges of the old world were extinguished. The new European order, a Pax Romana forged in the fires of the Great War and dictated by the victors, had no place for a fallen emperor. The Peace of Versailles was built upon the ruins of empires like theirs, and its architects ensured the Habsburgs would never threaten it again. Their sentence was exile to a remote, inescapable prison, the Portuguese island of Madeira. They arrived in November 1921 with nothing. The British warship HMS Cardiff deposited them on the island, and the world turned its back. They were a family of 10, Zeta, Karl, and their 8 children, with no income and no property, their assets seized by the new Austrian state. They were forced to live in a damp, unheated villa perched in the island's hills, a place ill-suited for the cold, wet winter. Zeta, ever practical, tried to make a home, but the isolation and poverty were crushing. For Karl, the psychological toll was immense. He was an emperor without an empire, a king without a kingdom, and now a father unable to provide for his family. In March 1922, after a trip into the cold city to buy toys for his son's birthday, Karl caught a chill. It quickly descended into a severe case of pneumonia. Without proper medicine or heating, his health collapsed. Zeta, who was pregnant with their 9th child, nursed him tirelessly, but his condition was fatal. On April 1, 1922, with Zeta by his side, Emperor Karl I of Austria, the last ruler of a 700-year-old dynasty, died at the age of 34. His final words were whispered to his wife, "I love you so much." At just 29 years old, Zeta was a widow and the sole guardian of the imperial legacy. She donned the black of mourning, a color she would wear for the remaining 67 years of her life. The new peace had its first imperial victim. In the wake of Karl's death, a new dynasty took shape, forged not in palaces, but in the crucible of exile. This was Zeta's family, the Habsburgs in waiting, and she was its undisputed matriarch. Her power was absolute, her purpose singular, to raise her eldest son, Otto, not merely as a man, but as the rightful emperor. She oversaw his rigorous education in politics, history, and languages, ensuring he would be prepared for the throne she believed he would one day reclaim. From their new homes, first in Spain and later in Belgium, Zeta became the center of the monarchist web, a formidable political operator who corresponded with legitimists and navigated the treacherous currents of European politics. But with this shadow power came a constant, gnawing paranoia, one that was entirely justified. They were stateless, their Austrian citizenship revoked. They were watched by the intelligence services of nations who saw them as a destabilizing force. Their very existence was a challenge to the new regimes that had replaced their empire. The greatest threat, however, emerged in Germany. Adolf Hitler held a deep-seated hatred for the Habsburgs, viewing their multi-ethnic Catholic empire as a betrayal of German racial purity. He saw Otto von Habsburg, with his intellectual opposition to Nazism and his claim on Austria, as a mortal enemy. When the Nazis annexed Austria in 1938, Otto was declared a traitor, and the family's remaining properties were confiscated. The paranoia became a desperate flight for survival. As Hitler's armies swept across Europe, Zeta and her children were forced to flee again, escaping through France and Spain to the relative safety of the United States. The exiled dynasty was now a family of refugees, hunted by the most powerful and paranoid regime in the world. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. For Empress Zeta, the study of history was not an academic exercise. It was a manual for survival, filled with precedents and warnings. And few warnings were as stark as the Roman year 69 AD, the year of the four emperors. It was a lesson in the terrifying speed of imperial collapse. After the forced suicide of the decadent Emperor Nero, the illusion of stable succession shattered. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguards, auctioned the throne to the highest bidder, proclaiming the elderly Governor Galba as emperor. His reign was a masterclass in political miscalculation, alienating the military through harsh discipline and a refusal to pay the promised bonuses. Within months, he was murdered in the Roman Forum, his head paraded on a spear. The lesson for Zeta was clear. A ruler who loses the loyalty of their army has lost everything. The chaos escalated. Otho, who had conspired against Galba, took the throne, only to be immediately challenged by Vitellius, a commander whose legions in Germania had proclaimed him emperor. The resulting civil war was brutal and swift, culminating in Otho's defeat and subsequent suicide. Yet, Vitellius's victory was equally fleeting. His reign was marked by gluttony and incompetence, a brief, indulgent pause before the next storm. As he feasted in Rome, the legions in the east, the true power brokers of the empire, declared their own candidate, Vespasian. The final act of the bloody drama saw Vespasian's forces march on Rome, leading to a desperate and violent battle within the city itself. Vitellius was dragged from his hiding place, tortured, and killed. For Zeta, watching her own multi-ethnic empire fracture along nationalist lines, this Roman precedent was terrifying. It demonstrated how quickly political legitimacy could evaporate, replaced by the raw, naked power of the military. It showed that an empire is not just a territory or a crown, but a shared belief in authority. Once that belief dies, the generals become kings, and the heart of the empire becomes a battlefield. After the bloody spectacle of 69 AD, Rome entered a period of unparalleled stability and prosperity, an era that future generations, including the Habsburgs, would look back upon as a near mythical golden age. This was the time of the five good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. For nearly a century, the empire was guided not by the violent whims of a dysfunctional dynasty, but by a novel principle: adoptive succession. The reigning emperor would choose his successor based on merit and ability, formally adopting him as his son and heir. This system, so alien to the rigid, blood-bound traditions of Zeta's world, produced a line of capable and dedicated rulers. Under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, his conquests celebrated on the magnificent column that still stands in Rome. He was the Optimus Princeps, the best of rulers, who oversaw massive public works projects and was lauded for his justice. His successor, Hadrian, was a different kind of emperor. A tireless administrator and a patron of the arts, he consolidated the borders, famously building his wall in Britain, and spent most of his reign touring the provinces, ensuring the machinery of empire ran smoothly. This era was the antithesis of the chaos Zeta would witness. It was a time when the vast, multicultural Roman world was bound together by a sense of shared peace and Roman identity. For Zeta and Charles, whose legitimacy was based entirely on the concept of divine right and ancient lineage, this period of Roman history must have presented a profound philosophical challenge. It suggested that the best way to secure a dynasty was, paradoxically, to abandon it. The stability of the Antonine dynasty was built on the rejection of hereditary rule, a concept that would have been both fascinating and heretical to the last Habsburg rulers. It was a perfect, unattainable model of what an empire could be when governed by wisdom instead of just by blood, a stark contrast to the crumbling, nationalistic world they inherited. If the age of the 5 good emperors was a dream of stability, the crisis of the 3rd century was the nightmare of collapse made real. For Zeta, living through the catastrophic dissolution of Austria-Hungary during and after World War I, this period of Roman history was not a distant lesson. It was a direct and agonizing parallel. The crisis began in 235 AD with the murder of Emperor Severus Alexander by his own troops, an act that plunged the Roman world into a half-century of anarchy. What followed was a seemingly endless parade of barracks emperors, short-lived rulers raised up and then murdered by their legions. In 50 years, more than 20 men claimed the title of emperor, with most meeting a violent end. This constant civil war paralyzed the state. The borders, once secure, became porous. Gothic tribes crossed the Danube, raiding deep into Greece, while the Sasanian Empire in the east captured an emperor, Valerian, in battle, an unimaginable humiliation. The parallels to Zeta's experience were uncanny. The internal political breakdown mirrored the nationalist movements tearing her own empire apart from within. The external threats from barbarian tribes were a historical echo of the immense pressures exerted by the Entente powers and neighboring states. The Roman economy shattered. To pay the soldiers who kept them in power, emperors relentlessly debased the currency, minting coins with almost no silver content. Hyperinflation spiraled out of control, trade ground to a halt, and citizens reverted to a barter economy. A devastating plague swept through the empire, further crippling its demographic and economic strength. At its height, the Roman Empire fractured into 3 competing states: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and the legitimate Roman government struggling to hold the center. For Zeta, this was the ultimate cautionary tale. An empire does not die from a single blow, but from 1,000 cuts. Political instability, military insurrection, economic ruin, and foreign invasion, all feeding upon one another until the entire structure gives way. Out of the chaos of the 3rd century crisis rose a figure of immense will and revolutionary vision, Diocletian. A low-born soldier who clawed his way to the throne in 284 AD, he understood that the empire could not be saved by traditional means. The old system was broken, and desperate times required radical solutions. For Zeta, whose world was irrevocably broken by a war that ended all empires, Diocletian's actions would have been a source of grim fascination. He did what was previously unthinkable. He divided the indivisible. Recognizing that the empire was too vast and beset by too many simultaneous threats for one man to govern, Diocletian instituted the Tetrarchy, or Rule of 4. He appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, to rule the west as a fellow Augustus, while he governed the east. Each Augustus then appointed a junior emperor, a Caesar, to serve as their subordinate and heir. This was not a secession, but a pragmatic administrative division designed to provide localized command and ensure a stable succession. To Zeta, a devout believer in the singular God-given authority of a monarch, this power-sharing arrangement would have seemed a profound compromise, an admission that the ideal of a single, unified imperium was no longer viable. Diocletian's reforms were sweeping and autocratic. He reorganized the provinces, expanded the bureaucracy, and separated civil and military power to reduce the risk of provincial governors launching rebellions. He attempted to fix the shattered economy with his edict on maximum prices, a well-intentioned but ultimately failed attempt at price controls. He also unleashed the Great Persecution, a brutal empire-wide effort to stamp out Christianity, which he saw as a threat to traditional Roman values and imperial unity. In the end, Diocletian's tetrarchy was a stopgap, not a permanent solution. But his decision to divide the empire into eastern and western administrative halves had lasting consequences, setting the stage for its eventual permanent split. For Zeta, his legacy was a powerful lesson. When an empire is on the brink of death, a ruler may be forced to sacrifice its most sacred principles just to ensure its survival, fundamentally changing it in the process. Just as Emperor Constantine saw in a new faith the potential to unify a fractured Roman Empire, Empress Zeta and Emperor Karl IV viewed their own deep Catholicism as the spiritual bedrock of their multi-ethnic realm. For Zeta, faith was not a matter of statecraft, but the very essence of her existence. Raised in a devout family, her piety was profound and unwavering, a guiding star in the encroaching darkness. The Habsburgs were not merely rulers, they were apostolic majesties, divinely appointed defenders of the Catholic Church. This was a role Zeta embraced with every fiber of her being. Their coronation in Budapest was not a political ceremony, but a holy sacrament, an unbreakable oath before God to protect their peoples. This sacred vow would later dictate their actions in the face of total collapse, preventing them from simply abdicating a throne they believed was bestowed by a power higher than any revolutionary committee. While Constantine's Edict of Milan was a revolutionary political act, Zeta's faith was a conservative anchor in a world unmoored by modernism, secularism, and nationalism. Her belief system was fundamentally at odds with the spirit of the age. As the war raged, she and Karl found a kindred spirit in Pope Benedict XV, who tirelessly appealed for peace. They secretly supported his initiatives, a move driven by their shared Catholic conscience, which saw the slaughter of millions of Christian subjects as an abomination. This very piety, however, made them suspect in the eyes of their German allies, who saw their desire for a just peace as weakness, even betrayal. In a sense, Zeta's court was the last bastion of a world where the crown and the cross were inextricably linked. But unlike Constantine, whose new religion eventually conquered the empire, Zeta's ancient faith could no longer hold the crumbling edifice of Austria-Hungary together against the tidal wave of the 20th century. Rome did not fall to external armies alone. It was hollowed out from within and beset by peoples at its borders who no longer respected its authority. For Empress Zeta and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the barbarians were not foreign tribes, but a new and terrifying force, the ideology of nationalism. For centuries, the Habsburg crown had held a dozen different ethnicities under a single imperial standard. But the Great War acted as a pressure cooker, bringing long-simmering ethnic tensions to a boiling point. These were the invaders who besieged Zeta's world, not with siege engines, but with pamphlets, political agitation, and demands for self-determination. From Prague to Zagreb, from Krakow to Budapest, the constituent peoples of the empire began to look past Vienna, envisioning their own independent nations. Emperor Karl, with Zeta's steadfast support, desperately tried to quell the tide. In October 1918, he issued the Volker Manifest, a last-ditch effort to transform the centralized empire into a federal union of autonomous states. It was a radical concession, an attempt to appease the nationalist forces by granting them the very thing they demanded, but within the imperial framework. It was too little, far too late. The barbarians were already inside the gates. The national councils rejected the manifesto outright, using it instead as a legal basis to declare their full independence. The empire was not being conquered, it was dissolving. Each declaration of independence was another brick pulled from the foundation, another legion defecting from the cause. For Zeta, this was an incomprehensible tragedy. She saw these movements not as a noble quest for freedom, but as a chaotic, destructive force, tearing apart a divinely ordained order that had, for all its flaws, maintained peace and stability in the heart of Europe for centuries. The enemies were no longer just in the trenches. They were in the parliaments, in the streets, and in the hearts of the very subjects she and her husband had sworn to protect. The historical sack of Rome was a brutal physical violation of the Eternal City. For Empress Zeta, the sacking of her world was a more silent, yet equally devastating, political and emotional upheaval in the autumn of 1918. The capital, Vienna, once the glittering heart of a vast empire, was now a city of hunger, uncertainty, and revolution. With the military collapse on the Italian front, the authority of the monarchy evaporated almost overnight. On November 11, 1918, the same day the armistice was signed in the West, Emperor Karl was presented with an ultimatum by the new German-Austrian government. He was not asked to abdicate, but to renounce participation in the affairs of state. For Zeta, the distinction was crucial. To abdicate would be to break the sacred coronation oath made to God. She famously told her wavering husband, "A sovereign can never abdicate. He can be deposed, all right. That is force. But abdicate, never, never, never. I would rather fall here at your side. Then there would be Otto. And even if all of us were killed, there would still be other Habsburgs." Her iron will strengthened Karl's resolve. He signed the proclamation, stepping back from power, but crucially not renouncing his throne. That evening, the imperial family left Schönbrunn Palace for the last time. It was a quiet, sorrowful departure, not a flight from a mob, but a surrender to the inevitable. The palace, for centuries the symbol of Habsburg power, was stripped of its masters. This was the sack of their home, their identity, and their purpose. As they drove away into the night, they were no longer rulers, but exiles. Their empire plundered not by foreign armies seeking gold, but by their own people seeking a new political future. The vast wealth of tradition, culture, and power was being dismantled, and Zeta and her family were now ghosts in their own land. When the Western Roman Empire fell, its institutions vanished, but its legacy echoed through the centuries, shaping the new nations of Europe. Similarly, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire marked the definitive end of an old world order. Yet its ghost continues to haunt the continent. Empress Zeta, who outlived her husband by 67 years, became the living embodiment of this fallen empire. Her long exile was not a quiet retirement, but a sustained, dignified protest against the verdict of history. She was the keeper of the flame, the custodian of a legitimacy that the world no longer recognized. In Spain, in Belgium, and finally in a Swiss monastery, she raised her 8 children, instilling in her eldest son, Otto, the unshakable belief that he was the rightful sovereign of a lost realm. She never relinquished her titles and never accepted the new reality, viewing the successor states as temporary arrangements. For Zeta, the fall of her West was a catastrophe that unleashed the demons of extremist nationalism, directly paving the way for the Second World War. Historians continue to debate the legacy of the Habsburgs. Was their empire an oppressive prison of nations, or was it a flawed but functional multinational society that offered a model of peaceful coexistence? The truth is complex and lies somewhere in between. What is certain is that its dissolution left a power vacuum in Central Europe, creating a series of small, unstable states vulnerable to predation by Nazi Germany and later the Soviet Union. Zeta's own final return to Austria was for her funeral in 1989. The ceremony, attended by thousands, was a final, spectral, imperial procession through the streets of Vienna. It was a poignant tribute to the last empress, a woman of unbending faith and tragic dignity, who represented not just the fall of a dynasty, but the end of an entire epoch.